Sarah's hands moved across the mahogany desk in practiced silence. The cloth in her grip collected dust from the surface, while her eyes tracked the morning light creeping through the study's tall windows. She had learned years ago to make herself part of the furniture, present but unnoticed, breathing but unheard. Colonel Whitmore stood 15 feet away near the door, speaking in low tones to someone in the hallway. Sarah continued her work, her movements steady and unremarkable. "The situation demands discretion," the colonel said. His voice carried the clipped authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "No one outside this house can know he's here." Sarah shifted to dust the bookshelf. The voices dropped lower. She heard fragments: federal orders, militia coordination, border provocation. The words meant nothing to her masters, who assumed she understood nothing beyond her immediate tasks. They were wrong. The door closed. Colonel Whitmore returned to his desk and Sarah became invisible again. She finished the shelves and moved to sweep the floor near his feet. He signed papers, muttering to himself about logistics and timing. Sarah kept her eyes down, her face blank. This was survival, not merely physical survival, though that mattered, but the deeper survival of keeping her true self hidden. The moment they saw her intelligence, her awareness, she would become dangerous to them. Dangerous things were removed. She left the study at 8 o'clock and walked through the back corridor to the kitchen. The heat hit her before she reached the doorway. Mama Ruth had the cook fire blazing, preparing breakfast for the household. Ruth stood at the work table, her dark hands kneading dough with mechanical efficiency. She was perhaps 60, though no one knew for certain. Her hair had gone white years ago and her back carried a permanent curve from decades of labor. "Morning," Sarah said quietly. Ruth glanced up, her eyes sharp despite her age. "You were in there a long time." Colonel had company in the hall. I waited. Ruth's hands never stopped moving. Company. Didn't see who. This was their language, careful words that said everything by saying nothing. Ruth understood. She returned to her dough and Sarah moved to the cupboard to retrieve plates for the morning service. The kitchen was a space of relative safety, insulated from the main house by walls and distance, though never truly safe. Mr. Crane, the overseer, made irregular visits to ensure no one was idle or speaking out of turn. The back door opened and Thomas entered, his shirt already soaked through with sweat despite the early hour. He was 19, Sarah's younger brother by 3 years, with their father's strong build and their mother's dark eyes. He carried a water bucket and set it down heavily near the door. "They're pushing hard today," he said to no one in particular. "Crane's in a mood." Mama Ruth nodded but said nothing. Sarah brought Thomas a cup and he drank quickly. She noticed fresh marks on his forearm, thin red lines where something had caught the skin. He saw her looking and pulled his sleeve down. "It's nothing." Sarah didn't argue. She had her own scars. The thin white line across her left wrist had been there for 10 years, since she was 12 and the colonel's wife had caught her looking at one of the children's books. Mrs. Whitmore had used a letter opener to make her point about where enslaved hands belonged. Sarah had learned the lesson, not to stop learning, but to never be caught again. Thomas left to return to the fields. Mama Ruth waited until the door closed before speaking. "What did you hear?" Sarah hesitated. Ruth was the closest thing to safety in this place, but even here, words could travel. Still, Ruth had been asking the careful questions for months now, sensing something building. She read the signs that others missed, the increased patrols along the border roads, the sudden arrival of men in military coats, the nervous energy in Colonel Whitmore's voice when he thought no one was listening. "Federal business," Sarah said finally. "Someone's coming to stay. They don't want anyone knowing." Ruth's hands paused for just a moment, then resumed. "Federal business this far south means trouble." Sarah nodded. The plantation sat in Western Virginia, close enough to the border that allegiances ran in competing directions. Some neighbors supported the federal government, others talked openly about secession. Colonel Whitmore tried to maintain profitable relationships with both sides, which meant constant calculation and compromise. Federal visitors were uncommon and usually signaled that calculation had failed somewhere. The morning routine continued. Sarah carried breakfast trays to the main dining room where the colonel and his wife took their meal in formal silence. Mrs. Whitmore was a thin woman with graying blonde hair and a permanent expression of dissatisfaction. She inspected every dish Sarah set before her, searching for reasons to criticize. Sarah had learned to make herself perfect in these small tasks. It was armor of a kind. "The silver needs polishing," Mrs. Whitmore said without looking up. "Yes, And the drawing room curtains. They are dusty." "Yes, Sarah returned to the kitchen. Ruth had her instructions ready. The guest room on the second floor needed preparation. Someone would be arriving before evening. Sarah climbed the back stairs with fresh linens and began the work of making the room acceptable. She opened the windows to air out the space, changed the bedding, swept the floor, and dusted every surface. The room faced east, overlooking the dirt road that led to the main gate. From here, she would see the visitor arrive. The afternoon dragged. Sarah worked through her regular tasks, polishing the silver as instructed, beating the dust from the drawing room curtains, helping Ruth prepare the evening meal. Thomas came back to the kitchen briefly at midday, his face drawn with exhaustion. The field work was brutal in August, the heat suffocating and relentless. Sarah brought him water and leftover bread. He ate quickly, said nothing, and left again. At 4 o'clock, Sarah returned to the guest room under the pretense of final preparations. She positioned herself near the window and waited. 15 minutes later, a rider appeared on the road. He came alone, moving at a steady pace, his horse showing signs of a long journey. The man wore civilian clothes but sat in the saddle with military posture. He carried a leather dispatch case secured across his chest. Sarah watched him reach the gate. One of the colonel's men opened it and the rider continued to the main house. She left the window and descended the back stairs quickly. By the time the visitor dismounted, she was in the kitchen, out of sight. Mama Ruth stirred a pot on the stove, her face carefully neutral. "He's here," Sarah said quietly. Ruth nodded. "Colonel will want tea served." Sarah prepared the service, a silver pot, 2 cups, small plates with biscuits Ruth had baked that morning. She arranged everything on a tray and carried it through to the drawing room. Colonel Whitmore and the stranger sat in leather chairs near the cold fireplace. The visitor looked to be in his 30s, with a lean face and tired eyes. The dispatch case rested on the floor beside his chair. Sarah entered without sound, set the tray on the side table, and began pouring. The men continued their conversation as if she didn't exist. "The president needs assurance," the visitor said. "The border situation requires immediate action." "I understand the urgency," Colonel Whitmore replied. "But mobilizing militia without proper cause will raise questions. The orders provide the cause. You'll receive confirmation through official channels, but the timeline is critical. We need coordinated action across 3 states." Sarah handed the colonel his tea, then served the guest. Her hands remained steady, her expression blank. She was furniture. "And if the opposition discovers the plan before we execute?" the colonel asked. "They won't. The orders are sealed. Only designated recipients know the full scope. Your role is limited but essential. Local militia under your command creates the necessary presence along the border." Sarah stepped back to the side table, waiting to see if they needed anything else. The visitor sipped his tea and continued. "There will be an incident. We'll call it Southern aggression, an unprovoked attack on federal interests. Your militia responds, federal troops deploy to restore order, and we have the justification we need for expanded intervention." The colonel frowned. "An incident means casualties. Regrettable but necessary. The alternative is allowing this situation to deteriorate further. Decisive action now prevents wider conflict later." Sarah understood enough. They were planning violence disguised as defense. Someone would die to justify the mobilization of more men who would cause more deaths. The pattern was familiar. She had seen it before in smaller forms, had heard the justifications, had watched the consequences unfold. Her father had died in a similar incident 7 years ago, caught between competing forces who both claimed righteousness. "When do you depart?" the colonel asked. "Dawn. I have 2 more deliveries before I return to Washington. The orders must reach all designated officers by week's end." "You'll stay the night then. I'll have a room prepared." "It's already prepared," the visitor said with a slight smile. "I saw the girl working in the window when I arrived." The colonel glanced at Sarah as if remembering she was there. "Yes. Sarah, show our guest to his room. He'll take supper in his quarters tonight. Privacy is essential." Sarah nodded and gestured toward the door. The visitor stood, retrieving his dispatch case. She led him through the hall and up the main staircase. He followed without speaking. At the guest room, she opened the door and stepped aside. "If you need anything, sir, I'll be in the kitchen." "The room is adequate," he said, entering. "Breakfast at 5. I leave before first light." "Yes, sir." She closed the door and returned downstairs. In the kitchen, Mama Ruth was preparing the guest's supper tray. Sarah took over the task without being asked, her mind working through what she had heard. Militia mobilization, manufactured incident, casualties labeled as justification. The visitor would carry his orders to other men in other places, and they would all act in coordination. How many would die in the incident? How many more in the escalation that followed? Ruth watched her work. "You're thinking too much. Dangerous habit." "I know. Can't change what powerful men decide." Sarah arranged the supper plates, roasted chicken, potatoes, bread. "No, we can't." But even as she said it, another part of her mind was asking a different question. The visitor would leave at dawn. He carried orders that would set events in motion. Those orders existed as physical documents in his dispatch case, which would be in his room tonight while he slept. The case had a lock, but locks could be managed. And if the orders never reached their destination, if they simply disappeared, what then? She carried the supper tray upstairs and knocked on the guest room door. He opened it, took the tray, and closed the door again without a word. Sarah returned to the kitchen and helped Ruth clean up. Thomas came in after dark, moving slowly with exhaustion. He ate in silence and went to his sleeping quarters behind the kitchen. Sarah lay on her thin mattress that night, staring at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept returning to the drawing room conversation, to the visitor's casual mention of casualties, to the dispatch case with its sealed orders. She thought about her father, killed in someone else's manufactured crisis. She thought about Thomas, about Mama Ruth, about all the people who would be caught in the machinery of this new plan. The visitor would leave at dawn. He had said 5 o'clock for breakfast. She would be expected to prepare and serve it. She would see him leave, watch him ride away with his orders, and then the events would unfold as planned. Unless... Sarah turned on her side and closed her eyes. The question persisted. What was one life measured against hundreds? What was one messenger measured against the violence he would enable? She had no answer yet, but the question had taken root. By morning, she would need to decide whether to let it grow or force it back into silence. The house settled into quiet. Sarah listened to the familiar sounds, the creak of old wood, the distant movement of mice in the walls, the occasional footstep from the floor above. Somewhere up there, the messenger slept with his dispatch case beside him. Somewhere beyond these walls, men were preparing to manufacture a crisis that would justify sending other men to die. Sarah had spent her entire life being invisible, being silent, being nothing in the eyes of those who owned her labor and her body. She had survived by accepting that she had no power, no voice, no right to act. But tonight, Lying in the dark, she felt the weight of what she knew pressing down like a physical force. Knowledge was its own kind of power, even for those who were supposed to have none. She closed her eyes and waited for dawn. Sarah woke before the rooster's call, her body trained to rise in darkness. She dressed quickly and moved through the silent house to the kitchen. Mama Ruth was already there, stoking the cook fire back to life. Neither woman spoke. Sarah began preparing breakfast: eggs, ham, biscuits, coffee strong enough to cut through exhaustion. The messenger had requested 5 o'clock service. She had perhaps 40 minutes to complete the work. The food came together with practiced efficiency. Sarah arranged everything on the formal serving tray while Ruth poured the coffee into the silver pot. At 5 minutes before the hour, Sarah carried the tray through to the dining room. The messenger was already seated, the dispatch case resting on the chair beside him. Colonel Whitmore sat across from him, both men deep in conversation. "The timeline cannot slip," the messenger was saying. "Governor Hayes needs his orders by Friday. Without his militia in position, the entire coordination fails." 3 days, the colonel said. "That's cutting it dangerously close. Which is why I leave immediately. 2 more stops, then back to Washington to confirm execution." Sarah set the plates before each man. The messenger nodded his thanks without looking at her. She poured coffee and stepped back to her position near the sideboard, ready to serve additional portions if needed. The men continued talking as if she had vanished. "The incident itself," the colonel said carefully. "What exactly are we engineering?" The messenger cut into his ham. "A border crossing. Federal supply convoy moving through disputed territory. Local militia, yours and 2 others, will be positioned nearby. The convoy encounters what appears to be Southern agitators. Shots are fired. Federal soldiers are killed. Your militia responds to protect federal interests. We have casualties. We have witnesses. We have justification for immediate escalation." "And the agitators?" "Carefully selected individuals whose deaths will not be questioned. The plan accounts for all variables." Sarah's hands remained still at her sides. Her face showed nothing. Inside, her mind was recording every word, every detail. The colonel shifted in his seat, uncomfortable but not objecting. "How many casualties are we expecting?" "The convoy. Perhaps a dozen federal soldiers. The agitators? Another dozen. Your militia. Minimal if they follow orders correctly. Stay back. Engage only after the initial attack. Play the role of defenders. Total acceptable losses, under 30. "Acceptable," the colonel repeated, the word sitting wrong in his mouth. "Compared to the alternative of protracted conflict that could kill thousands? Yes. Acceptable." The messenger finished his coffee and Sarah stepped forward to refill the cup. "The president has authorized this action because intelligence suggests southern states are preparing their own provocations. We need to control the narrative, strike first, establish the moral high ground. This isn't about starting war, Colonel. It's about preventing one on their terms." The colonel said nothing. Sarah returned to her position. The messenger checked his pocket watch. "I should depart. The road to Hayes's territory is a full day's ride." Both men stood. Sarah moved quickly to clear the dishes, giving them space to exit the dining room. She heard them move toward the front hall, their voices fading. She stacked the plates on her tray and carried everything back to the kitchen. Mama Ruth was rolling dough for the day's bread, her movements automatic. "They're leaving," Sarah said quietly. "Good. Less trouble in the house." Sarah set the tray down and began washing dishes. Through the window, she could see the messenger's horse being brought around. The colonel stood on the front steps, shaking the man's hand. The dispatch case hung from the messenger's shoulder, the leather worn smooth from travel. Inside that case were the orders for Governor Hayes, orders that would position militia for the manufactured attack, orders that would kill 30 people to justify killing more. The messenger mounted and rode toward the gate. Sarah watched until he disappeared from view, then turned back to her work. Her hands moved through the washing automatically while her mind stayed fixed on what she had heard. 30 deaths labeled acceptable. 30 lives measured and dismissed in a breakfast conversation. The men who made such calculations never had to see the bodies, never had to tell the families, never had to carry the weight of names and faces. Her father had been one of those acceptable losses. 7 years ago, a similar calculation had placed him in the path of a conflict he didn't understand and couldn't escape. The men who ordered his death had probably discussed it over breakfast too, nodding about necessary sacrifices and acceptable costs. Sarah finished the dishes and moved to sweep the kitchen floor. Mama Ruth pulled the bread from the oven and set the loaves to cool. The morning routine continued. Sarah cleaned the dining room, dusted the drawing room, prepared the Colonel's study for his daily work. Every task was familiar, every movement practiced. Her body performed while her mind circled the same questions. At midday, she returned to the guest room to strip the bed and air out the space. The room still smelled faintly of the messenger's travel, horse, leather, road dust. She opened the windows and began removing the linens. As she pulled the sheets free, something caught her eye. The bedside table drawer sat slightly open, as if hastily closed. Sarah hesitated, then opened it fully. Inside lay a folded paper, the kind used for personal correspondence. The messenger must have been writing last night and forgotten it. Sarah picked it up carefully. The handwriting was neat and precise. Dearest Mary, I hope this letter finds you and the children well. The roads have been long, but I expect to complete my deliveries by week's end and return home. Tell Thomas his father misses him and will bring a surprise from the capital. All my love, John. Sarah reread the words. John. The messenger had a name. He had a wife named Mary, a son named Thomas. He was writing letters to his family while carrying orders that would kill other fathers, other sons. The contradiction sat heavy in her hands. She set the letter back in the drawer, closed it, and continued her work. But the letter had changed something. The messenger was no longer just a federal courier, a faceless agent of distant power. He was a man going home to his family. He had a son. He wrote love letters. And Sarah was beginning to understand that if she acted on the questions forming in her mind, if she followed through on the thoughts she had been avoiding all morning, John would not return home to Mary and Thomas. She carried the soiled linens downstairs and began the washing. Thomas came to the kitchen for his midday meal, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. He ate quickly, saying little. Sarah brought him water and he drank without pausing. Crane's been worse than usual, he said finally. Something's got him agitated. Federal visitor, Sarah said. Made everyone nervous. Thomas nodded. They're always planning something. Always moving pieces around. We are just in the way of it. Sarah wanted to tell him what she had heard, wanted to share the weight of the knowledge, but she held back. Thomas had his own anger, his own calculations about what was acceptable. She had seen it growing in him over the past year, the tightness in his jaw, the way his hands curled into fists when Crane's voice carried across the fields, the conversations he had with other field workers that stopped when she approached. Don't do anything stupid, she said quietly. He looked at her directly. Stupid like what? You know what. Thomas stood, pushing back from the table. Doing nothing is what's stupid. Waiting, accepting, surviving. Where does that get us? Nowhere. Just more of the same until we are dead or sold or broken. And fighting gets you killed. Maybe. Or maybe it gets us free. Sarah shook her head. Not the way you're thinking. Not violence against violence. That's their game and they're better at it. You can't win fighting their way. Then what way, Sarah? What way do we fight? She had no answer she could give him. The truth was still forming in her mind, still testing itself against her conscience. She couldn't tell him that she was considering murder disguised as accident, couldn't explain that she was calculating whether one death could prevent 30, couldn't admit that she was thinking like the men who had calculated her father's death. Thomas left without waiting for her response. Sarah returned to her washing, her hands moving through hot water while her mind turned over the problem. The messenger, John, would reach Governor Hayes by evening. Hayes would receive the orders, position his militia, and the machinery would begin moving. Within a week, the manufactured incident would occur. 30 people would die. Federal troops would mobilize in response. The escalation would feed itself, growing beyond the control of anyone who had set it in motion. Unless the orders never arrived. Sarah finished the washing and hung the linens to dry. The afternoon stretched ahead with its regular tasks. She moved through them mechanically, her mind elsewhere. At 3 o'clock, she was in the colonel's study, dusting the shelves, when she noticed the locked drawer in his desk. She knew what it contained, his pistol, kept loaded in case of emergency. She also knew where he kept the key, hidden under a loose floorboard near the window. She could retrieve the pistol tonight. She could intercept the messenger on the road tomorrow morning. A shot from hiding, the dispatch case taken, the body left to be found later. Robbery gone wrong. The orders lost. But guns were loud and imprecise. Too many variables. Too much risk of being seen or heard. Sarah put the pistol idea aside and continued dusting. There had to be another way, something quieter, something she could control. The messenger would complete his journey. He was already gone. But there were other messengers carrying other orders. The colonel had mentioned multiple coordination points. If she couldn't stop John, perhaps she could stop the next one. Evening came. Sarah helped prepare supper and served the colonel and his wife their meal. Mrs. Whitmore complained about the heat, about the quality of the vegetables, about the state of the curtains despite Sarah having cleaned them that morning. Sarah accepted the criticism without response, cleared the dishes, and returned to the kitchen. Mama Ruth sat at the work table, peeling potatoes for tomorrow's meal. Sarah joined her, working in silence. After several minutes, Ruth spoke without looking up. "You're going to do something." It wasn't a question. Sarah kept peeling. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do. I can see it. You've been different since yesterday. Since that man arrived." Sarah set down her knife. "You didn't hear what they talked about." "Didn't need to. Men like that bring death with them. It's what they do." "And what are we supposed to do about it? We are nothing. We have no power." Ruth finally looked at her, and Sarah saw something ancient and knowing in her eyes. Nothing has a way of being everything when the time comes. You know the story of Denmark Vesey. Sarah knew it, the planned slave rebellion in Charleston 30 years ago, betrayed before it could execute. Vesey had been hanged along with dozens of others. He failed. He acted. That's not the same as failing. Ruth returned to her work. Sometimes the invisible hand is the only one that can reach the places that need reaching. Everyone's watching the big hands, the obvious hands. They forget the small ones moving in the background. And if the small hand does something that can't be undone, then it can't be undone. But the world changes anyway. Question is whether you can live with what you've done. Sarah picked up her knife again. "I don't know if I can." "Then you probably shouldn't do it. But if you're going to do it anyway, do it smart. Don't be stupid like that Vesey. Don't trust anyone, don't tell anyone, and don't expect gratitude. Just do it and move on." They finished the potatoes in silence. Sarah thought about Ruth's words, the invisible hand, the places that needed reaching. She thought about the dispatch case with its sealed orders, about John writing letters to his family, about her father dying in someone else's manufactured crisis. She thought about Thomas and his anger, about the 30 people marked for acceptable death, about the escalation that would follow. The night settled over the plantation. Sarah lay on her mattress again, sleepless again. But this time, the question had transformed into something harder. Not whether to act, but how. Not whether she had the right, but whether she could live with the alternative. By morning, she would need a plan. By morning, she would need to decide if she was the invisible hand that could reach where others couldn't. By morning, she would need to accept what that meant, for John, for Mary, and Thomas, for herself. The house creaked in its familiar rhythms. Sarah stared at the ceiling and waited for clarity that didn't come. What she found instead was a cold certainty. If she did nothing, people would die. If she acted, people would die. The only difference was which people and how many. She closed her eyes and made her choice. Sarah did not sleep. She lay in the darkness and worked through the problem with cold precision. The messenger John was already gone, beyond her reach. But the colonel had mentioned coordination, multiple officers receiving orders, multiple messengers making deliveries. If one set of orders failed to arrive, the entire plan might collapse. The coordination required precision. Remove one piece and the machinery could not function. She turned the possibilities over in her mind. Another messenger would come. The colonel would receive his formal orders through official channels. That messenger would stay overnight, just as John had. That messenger would be vulnerable. But vulnerability required opportunity, and opportunity required planning. Sarah thought through the layout of the house, the patterns of movement, the moments when she would be alone with a visitor. Serving breakfast. That was the pattern John had followed. Early morning meal before departure. The dining room would be empty except for the colonel and the guest. She would be serving. She would be invisible. A gun would be too loud. She discarded that option immediately. A knife would require getting close, would risk struggle and noise. She needed something that looked like accident, something that would raise no suspicion. Her mind moved through the kitchen inventory. Heavy iron pots, cast iron skillets, the meat cleaver. Objects meant for cooking that could serve other purposes. The skillet. Heavy enough to do damage with a single blow. Common enough that its presence anywhere in the house would raise no questions. She could carry it upstairs as if moving it between storage and kitchen. If questioned, she had been cleaning, organizing, performing her endless tasks. The weapon would hide in plain sight. Sarah sat up in the darkness. The plan was forming, but it required more than just method. It required accepting what she would become. Not a victim fighting for survival in the moment, but a killer acting with premeditation. She would choose the target, plan the execution, and follow through with full knowledge of what she was doing. There would be no claim of self-defense, no justification of immediate threat. Just murder dressed as accident. She thought about her father again. He had been moving supplies through a border crossing when militia on both sides had opened fire. The official report called it unfortunate casualties in the crossfire of southern aggression. Her father had been carrying flour. He had died because someone needed bodies to justify their next move. The men who ordered that engagement had probably never learned his name. Now she was considering doing the same thing, killing someone to prevent more killings. She would become what she hated, use the same calculation, accept the same logic. One life against many. Acceptable losses. The thought made her sick, but it didn't stop her. Hours passed. Sarah tracked the progression of night by sound, the last movements from the main house, the settling of old wood, the silence that preceded dawn. At some point, exhaustion pulled her into brief, restless sleep. She dreamed of her father's face, of blood on flour sacks, of her mother's hands the day they were separated. She woke with her heart racing and did not try to sleep again. Before first light, she rose and dressed. The house was still dark when she entered the kitchen. Mama Ruth was not yet up. Sarah had perhaps 30 minutes alone. She lit a single candle and moved through the familiar space. The large cast-iron skillet hung on its hook near the stove. She lifted it down and felt the weight. 8 pounds, maybe 10. Solid iron with a wooden handle. One strike to the back of the head would be enough if done correctly. She set the skillet on the work table and stared at it. This was the moment of truth before the moment of action. She could still walk away. She could replace the skillet on its hook, go about her day, let the machinery of powerful men run its course. 30 people would die, but their blood would not be on her hands. She would remain clean, remain blameless, remain powerless. Sarah picked up the skillet and carried it upstairs to the guest room. She hid it in the wardrobe, behind folded blankets. If questioned, she would say she found it misplaced and intended to return it to the kitchen. Small lie, easy to believe. She went back downstairs and began her morning routine. Mama Ruth arrived as the sun broke the horizon. She looked at Sarah's face and said nothing. They prepared breakfast together in silence. Coffee, eggs, biscuits. Normal food for a normal morning. Sarah's hands were steady. That surprised her. She had expected trembling, some physical manifestation of what she was planning. Instead, she felt cold and clear. You barely slept, Ruth said finally.
No.
Going to tell me why?
No.
Ruth nodded. Then I won't ask. But Sarah, whatever you're thinking, be certain. Once some things are done, they don't get undone. I know. They finished the preparations. Sarah carried breakfast to the Colonel and his wife, served them without incident, and returned to the kitchen. The day progressed with agonizing normalcy. She cleaned, she washed, she prepared meals. Thomas came at midday, ate quickly, and left. Mr. Crane made his rounds, watching everyone with his usual suspicion. The Colonel worked in his study. Mrs. Whitmore criticized the condition of her curtains for the 3rd time that week. Nothing happened. No messenger arrived. Sarah went to bed that night with the skillet still hidden in the guest room wardrobe. Her plan formed but not executed. She felt oddly empty, as if she had already committed the act and was living in its aftermath. 2 days passed in the same pattern. On the 3rd day, a rider appeared on the road at 3 in the afternoon. Sarah was in the drawing room, dusting furniture she had dusted the day before. She saw him through the window, another federal courier, another leather dispatch case, another man carrying orders from the president. This messenger was younger than John, perhaps 25, with red hair and a nervous energy in his movements. Colonel Whitmore greeted him at the door and led him to the study. Sarah continued her work, ears straining for fragments of conversation. She heard little. The door was closed, voices kept deliberately low. But the pattern was repeating. The messenger would stay overnight. He would leave at dawn. He had orders to deliver. That evening, Sarah served supper to the guest in the dining room. The Colonel joined him, and their conversation was carefully vague, discussing weather and road conditions instead of federal plans. The messenger seemed tired but alert, his eyes moving around the room constantly. He thanked Sarah for the meal without really seeing her. Breakfast at 5, the Colonel told him. You'll want an early start. Yes, sir. I appreciate the hospitality. Sarah cleared the dishes and returned to the kitchen. Mama Ruth was banking the fire for the night, preparing the kitchen for morning. She glanced at Sarah but said nothing. Sarah washed the dishes, dried them, put everything away with mechanical precision. Her mind was racing while her body went through practice motions. Tonight. It had to be tonight. The messenger would sleep, he would wake early, he would expect breakfast at 5. Sarah would prepare the meal, serve it, and while serving, she would act. The skillet was already in place. She needed only courage or cold determination or whatever drove people to kill. The house settled into night. Sarah lay on her mattress, fully dressed, waiting for time to pass. She thought about the messenger upstairs. Did he write letters to his family too? Did he have children waiting for him to come home? She pushed the questions away. They didn't matter. What mattered was the dispatch case beside his bed, the orders inside it, the 30 deaths those orders would cause. At midnight, Sarah rose. She moved through the dark house like a ghost, her feet finding the path by memory. She climbed the stairs and paused outside the guest room. No sound from within. She continued to the Colonel's study and knelt by the window, finding the loose floorboard by touch. The key was where it always was. She took it, unlocked the desk drawer, and removed the pistol. Not to use, she had already decided against that, but to create the appearance of theft if needed. She could drop it near the body, suggest robbery. No. That was too elaborate, too many variables. She replaced the pistol and locked the drawer again. Simple was better. An accident. A fall. A tragic misfortune. She went to the guest room and quietly retrieved the skillet from the wardrobe. The metal was cold in her hands. She stood in the darkness, holding the weapon, breathing slowly. This was the moment. She could still choose differently. Sarah thought about her mother, sold away when Sarah was 8. She thought about her father, killed in someone else's manufactured crisis. She thought about Thomas working in the fields, about Mama Ruth's bent back from decades of labor, about every person trapped in this system of calculated cruelty. She thought about the 30 people marked for acceptable death, about the escalation that would follow, about the machinery that ground people into justification for more grinding. She had no legal right to act. She was property, not a person. She could not vote, could not testify in court, could not own anything including herself. But standing in the darkness with the skillet in her hands, she claimed a right that no law recognized, the right to decide whether to stop violence before it started. Sarah carried the skillet downstairs and placed it on the kitchen work table. She would need it in the morning. For now, she needed to prepare herself mentally for what was coming. She sat in the dark kitchen and forced herself to visualize the act in detail. The messenger would be eating breakfast. The Colonel might be present or might not. Either way, there would be a moment when the messenger turned away, looking out the window or reaching for coffee. She would move behind him. One strike, precise and powerful, to the base of the skull. He would fall. She would drop the skillet as if shocked, as if it had slipped from her hands while she was serving. Accident. Tragedy. The Colonel would be angry but would have no proof of intent. The dispatch case would be her target afterward. She would need to retrieve it without raising suspicion, burn the orders, return the case to make it look like nothing was missing. Or perhaps take the case entirely, make it look like theft, give the Colonel a narrative about robbery. She would decide in the moment, based on circumstances. Sarah sat alone in the dark kitchen and accepted what she was about to become. Not a victim, not a survivor, but a killer. She would murder a man who had done nothing to her personally. She would do it with premeditation and cold calculation. She would carry that weight for the rest of her life. But 30 people would not die in the manufactured incident. The coordination would fail. The orders would not reach their destinations. The machinery would stall, at least temporarily. Maybe permanently. Maybe her act would save lives. Maybe it would only delay the inevitable. She would never know for certain. Dawn was 2 hours away. Sarah remained in the kitchen, watching darkness fade to grey. She thought about praying but had no faith in a God who allowed this world to exist. She thought about crying but had no tears left. She thought about running but had nowhere to go. Instead, she stood and began preparing breakfast. Eggs, ham, biscuits, coffee. The same meal she had served John, the same meal she had served 100 other people. Her hands moved through familiar motions while her mind stayed cold and clear. This was happening. She had decided. Now she would act. At 4:30, Mama Ruth entered the kitchen. She took one look at Sarah's face and understood something had changed. "You're sure?" Ruth said quietly. "Yes." "Can't help you after." "I know." "Can't protect you if it goes wrong." "I know." Ruth nodded and began helping with the breakfast preparation. They worked in silence, 2 women preparing food that one of them would use to serve murder. At 4:55, Sarah arranged everything on the tray. She picked up the cast-iron skillet from the work table and set it beside the plates, as if she had just finished cooking and was bringing it to table as well. Natural. Unremarkable. She carried the tray through the dark house to the dining room. The messenger was already seated, the dispatch case beside his chair. Colonel Whitmore had not yet arrived. He sometimes slept later than his guests. Sarah would be alone with the messenger. She set the tray down and began arranging the plates. The messenger nodded his thanks and reached for his coffee. His back was to her as he lifted the cup to his lips. The window faced east, showing the first light of dawn. He was looking at it, his attention elsewhere. Sarah picked up the skillet. It was heavy and solid in her hands. She thought about nothing except the precise point where skull met spine. She thought about accuracy, about force, about finality. The messenger turned slightly, starting to speak. "Is the Colonel?" Sarah swung the skillet with all her strength. The metal connected with a sound that was somehow both loud and quiet, bone giving way under iron. The messenger dropped without a word, his body falling sideways from a chair. His coffee cup shattered on the floor. Blood began pooling beneath his head. Sarah stood frozen, the skillet still in her hands. The messenger's leg twitched once, then went still. She had done it. She had killed him. There was no taking it back now. She set the skillet on the table and knelt beside the body. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. She checked for breathing and found none. His chest did not rise. The blow had killed him instantly or near enough. She felt nothing. No satisfaction. No horror, just cold emptiness. The dispatch case. She grabbed it and opened the buckles. Inside were sealed orders addressed to Colonel Marcus Hayes, 3rd Virginia Militia. She took them out and shoved them inside her dress. The case went back beside the fallen chair. Sarah heard footsteps on the stairs. The Colonel was coming. She had seconds to position herself, to create the scene. She dropped the skillet on the floor as if it had fallen from her shock hands. She stepped back from the body, putting distance between herself and the weapon. When the Colonel entered the dining room, she was standing against the wall, her face a mask of fear. "I heard." He stopped, seeing the body. "What happened?" Sarah forced her voice to shake. "He fell, Master. I was serving breakfast and he just fell. Hit his head on the table edge." The Colonel moved quickly to the body, checking for signs of life. "He's dead." He looked up at Sarah. "You saw him fall?" "Yes, Master. He was drinking coffee, then he just fell." The Colonel's eyes moved to the skillet on the floor, to the broken coffee cup, to the blood spreading beneath the messenger's head. His face showed suspicion but also calculation. A dead federal messenger was a problem regardless of cause. Did anyone else see this? "No, Master. Just me." He stood, pacing the room. "Federal authorities will investigate. They'll want to know what happened. This man carried important documents." Sarah said nothing. The Colonel went to the dispatch case and opened it. His face went pale. "The orders. Where are the orders?" "Orders, Master. This case should contain sealed documents. They are gone." His eyes locked on Sarah with sudden intensity. "Did you take them?" "No, Master. I don't know anything about orders. I just served breakfast." The Colonel grabbed her arm, his grip painful. "If you're lying to me, if you had anything to do with this." "I didn't, Master. I swear. I was just serving food and he fell." He released her and returned to pacing. Sarah kept her face fearful, her body trembling. Inside, she felt nothing but the cold certainty that she had succeeded. The orders were hidden in her dress. The messenger was dead. The coordination would fail. "Get Ruth," the Colonel said finally. "We need to move the body before anyone else sees. This stays quiet until I decide how to report it." Sarah ran to the kitchen. Ruth was waiting, her face grim. "It's done. It's done." They returned to the dining room together. The colonel had covered the body with a tablecloth. "Help me carry him to the cellar. We'll say he never arrived. The roads aren't safe. Bandits, robbers. The federal government will believe one of their messengers was killed before reaching us." Sarah and Ruth lifted the body by its shoulders while the colonel took the legs. They carried it down the cellar stairs and laid it in the corner behind stored grain sacks. The colonel found a shovel and began digging. Sarah understood. He would bury the messenger here, on the plantation, where no one would find him. The dead man would simply disappear. They worked in silence for an hour. When the grave was deep enough, they rolled the body in and covered it with earth. The colonel packed the dirt down and replaced the grain sacks over the spot. No trace remained. "The case," the colonel said. "I'll report it as stolen by whoever killed the messenger. The orders are lost. That's the story." Sarah nodded. She had succeeded beyond her original plan. Not only were the orders destroyed, but the messenger's death would be blamed on bandits. The colonel's own fear of federal investigation had created her cover story. They went upstairs. The colonel told Sarah to clean the dining room, remove all evidence of what had happened. She scrubbed blood from the floor, washed the skillet, replaced the broken coffee cup. When she was finished, the room showed no sign of violence. She returned to the kitchen and finally allowed herself to feel the weight of what she had done. Her hands began to shake. Mama Ruth pressed a cup of water into them. "Drink." Sarah drank. Her throat was tight, her stomach churning. She had murdered a man. She had struck him from behind and watched him die. She was a killer now, regardless of justification. Can you live with it? Ruth asked quietly. Sarah thought about the sealed orders hidden in her dress, about the 30 people who would not die in the manufactured incident, about the coordination that would fail without these orders reaching Colonel Hayes. She thought about her father, about Thomas, about everyone trapped in the machinery of powerful men's calculations. "I have to," she said. Ruth nodded. "Then you will. Now burn those papers before someone finds them on you." Sarah went to the cook fire and pulled the folded orders from her dress. She opened them once, reading the precise instructions for militia positioning, timing, and expected engagement. Everything was there, the manufactured incident spelled out in official language. She fed the papers to the flames and watched them burn. It was done. She had killed the messenger, stolen the orders, and prevented the coordination. Whatever came next, she had altered the course of events. One invisible hand reaching where others could not. She returned to her regular work, moving through the day with mechanical precision. By evening, she was exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with physical labor. She lay on her mattress that night and stared at the ceiling, seeing the messenger's face in the darkness, hearing the sound of metal striking bone, feeling the weight of the skillet in her hands. She had become what she needed to become. She had acted with cold calculation and irreversible violence. She had claimed a power that no law recognized and used it to kill. And 30 people would live who would have died. Sarah closed her eyes and waited for sleep that would not bring peace. The blow connected with precisely the force Sarah had calculated. The messenger's body went rigid for a fraction of a second before collapsing sideways from a chair. His coffee cup fell from his hand and shattered on the floor. The sound of breaking porcelain seemed impossibly loud in the quiet morning, but it was nothing compared to the wet crack of metal against bone that still echoed in Sarah's ears. The messenger hit the ground with his shoulder twisted at an unnatural angle. His eyes were open, pupils already beginning to dilate. A thin stream of blood ran from his nose and the corner of his mouth. His chest rose once, a shallow, mechanical breath, then went still. Sarah stood frozen, the cast-iron skillet heavy in her hands, and watched the light fade from his eyes. It took perhaps 15 seconds. She counted them. 15 seconds to become a killer. The practical part of her mind took control. She had minutes, perhaps less, before someone heard the commotion or came looking for her. She set the skillet on the dining table and knelt beside the body. Her hands moved to his neck, checking for a pulse she knew would not be there. The skin was still warm. His eyes stared past her at the ceiling. She closed them with trembling fingers. The dispatch case sat against the chair leg where he had placed it. Sarah grabbed it and worked the buckles open with shaking hands. Inside were 3 sealed envelopes, each marked with official stamps and addressed to different militia commanders. Colonel Marcus Hayes, 3rd Virginia Militia. Colonel William Thornton, 2nd Maryland Militia. Major Robert Ashford, Border Guard Detail. She pulled them all out and shoved them inside the front of her dress, the paper crackling against her skin. The empty case went back where it had been. She stood and looked at the scene with cold assessment. The body, the blood pooling beneath the head, the broken coffee cup, the skillet on the table. It looked like violence, not accident. She needed to change that. Sarah picked up the skillet again and dropped it on the floor as if it had fallen from her shock hands. She kicked the larger pieces of the broken cup under the sideboard where they might have bounced. She moved the chair slightly to make it look like the messenger had fallen backward and struck the table edge. The blood was wrong. There was too much of it, and the wound at the base of his skull was too clean, too obviously caused by a heavy blow rather than a fall. She heard footsteps on the stairs. No more time. She pressed herself against the wall, arranged her face into an expression of shock and fear, and waited. Colonel Whitmore entered the dining room buttoning his coat. He took 2 steps before seeing the body on the floor. His face went from irritation to alarm in an instant. What happened? His voice was sharp. He fell, Master. Sarah made her voice shake. I was serving breakfast and he fell. I think he hit his head on the table. The colonel moved quickly to the body, kneeling to check for life. His hands went to the messenger's neck, then to his chest. He's dead. He looked up at Sarah. You saw him fall? Yes, Master. He was drinking coffee, then he just collapsed. I couldn't catch him. The colonel's eyes moved around the room, taking in details. The skillet on the floor. The broken cup. The blood spreading in a dark pool. His face tightened with suspicion, but there was something else there too. Calculation. Sarah recognized it. He was already thinking about consequences, about how this would look to federal authorities, about what story would serve him best. Did anyone else see this? He asked. No, Master. Just me. He stood and went to the dispatch case, opening it. His hands rifled through the interior and came up empty. His face went pale. The orders. Where are the orders? Sarah kept her voice steady. Orders, Master? I don't know anything about orders. This man was carrying sealed documents. They are gone. He grabbed her arm, his grip hard enough to bruise. Did you take them? No, Master. I swear. I don't know anything about any documents. I was just serving breakfast. The colonel released her and began pacing. Sarah watched him work through the problem. A dead federal messenger was bad enough. A dead messenger with missing orders was a catastrophe that would bring investigators, questions, possibly accusations of treason. The colonel was not a stupid man. He understood immediately that his position was dangerous regardless of what had actually happened. This stays quiet, he said finally. No one speaks of this outside this house. Do you understand? Yes, Master. Get Ruth. Tell no one else. We need to move the body before the household wakes. Sarah ran to the kitchen. Mama Ruth was standing at the work table, her hands still, her face already knowing. It's done. It's done. Colonel wants you in the dining room. We are moving the body. Ruth wiped her hands on her apron and followed without another word. In the dining room, the colonel had covered the messenger's body with a tablecloth. Blood was soaking through the white fabric in a spreading stain. "We'll take him to the cellar," the colonel said. "The two of you carry his shoulders. I'll take the legs." They lifted the body between them. The messenger was lighter than Sarah expected, as if death had already begun to hollow him out. They carried him through the kitchen and down the narrow stairs to the cellar. The space smelled of earth and stored grain. The colonel gestured to the far corner behind stacks of supply sacks. "Put him there." They laid the body on the dirt floor. The colonel found a shovel leaning against the stone wall and began digging. Sarah understood immediately. He was going to bury the messenger here, on the plantation, where no one would ever find him. She had expected a report to federal authorities, some official story. Instead, the colonel was choosing complete concealment. "Master," Sarah said carefully, "what about the federal government? Won't they come looking for him? They'll assume bandits or southern agitators got him on the road. Happens often enough." The colonel drove the shovel deeper into the earth. "The messenger never arrived here. We never saw him. That's the story if anyone asks." Sarah and Ruth exchanged glances. The colonel's solution was better than anything Sarah had planned. Not only would the orders never reach their destination, but the messenger's death would be blamed on random violence. She would be completely clear of suspicion. They worked for over an hour. The colonel dug while Sarah and Ruth moved grain sacks to make space. When the grave was deep enough, 4 feet, maybe 5, they rolled the messenger's body into it. The corpse landed face down in the dark earth. The colonel threw the first shovelful of dirt onto the body, and Sarah felt something twist in her chest. She had killed this man, and now she was helping bury him in an unmarked grave. His family would never know what happened to him. His wife Mary and his son Thomas would wait for a letter that would never come. She pushed the thought away. 30 people would not die because of her action. That had to be enough. They covered the grave and packed the earth down. The colonel replaced the grain sacks over the spot, arranging them to look undisturbed. No trace remained of the violence that had occurred. The messenger had simply vanished. "Go clean the dining room," the colonel told Sarah. "Every trace of blood, every drop. The skillet, the floor, everything. When you're done, it never happened." "Yes, master." Sarah and Ruth returned upstairs. In the kitchen, Ruth heated water for cleaning while Sarah retrieved scrub brushes and rags. They worked together in silence, moving to the dining room with their supplies. The blood had dried partially, leaving dark stains on the floorboards. Sarah scrubbed until her hands were raw and the wood showed no trace of what had soaked into it. The skillet went back to its hook in the kitchen, washed clean. The broken coffee cup pieces went into the trash. Fresh coffee was brewed and a new cup set out. Sarah reset the dining table as if breakfast had simply not yet been served. When she was finished, the room looked exactly as it had the day before, peaceful, orderly, showing no sign that a man had died violently on its floor. She carried the cleaning water outside to dump it and paused behind the kitchen. Her hands were shaking violently now. The adrenaline that had kept her moving was fading, leaving behind the full weight of what she had done. She leaned against the wall and tried to breathe steadily. She had murdered a man. She had struck him from behind without warning. She had watched him die. She had stolen official documents and helped bury his body in secret. These were facts that could not be changed. She was a killer now, and no amount of justification would alter that reality. Mama Ruth appeared beside her. "Come inside before someone sees you." Sarah followed her back to the kitchen. Ruth pressed a cup into her hands. Water, not coffee. Sarah drank mechanically. "Can you keep working today?" Ruth asked quietly. "I have to." "Then do it. Don't think. Don't feel. Just work." Sarah nodded. She understood the wisdom in Ruth's words. She could not afford to break down, could not afford to show any sign that something terrible had happened. She was enslaved, she was invisible, and she needed to remain exactly that, unremarkable, unmemorable, beneath notice. The day progressed with agonizing slowness. Sarah moved through her tasks with mechanical precision. She cleaned the guest room where the messenger had slept, stripping the bed and washing the linens. She dusted the drawing room. She helped prepare the midday meal. Every action was automatic. Her mind stayed carefully blank. Thomas came to the kitchen at noon. He ate quickly, his usual pattern, but as he was leaving he paused and looked at Sarah directly. "You look different," he said.
"I'm tired." "No."
"It's something else." His eyes searched her face. "What happened?" "Nothing happened. I'm just tired." He didn't believe her, but he didn't push. He left for the fields and Sarah went back to her work. She couldn't tell him. She couldn't tell anyone. The weight of the secret pressed down on her chest like a physical force. In the afternoon, Colonel Whitmore called her to his study. Sarah entered with her heart pounding, prepared for accusation or interrogation. Instead, the colonel sat at his desk writing a letter. "I'm reporting to federal authorities that their messenger never arrived," he said without looking up. "Presumed waylaid by criminals on the road. You will confirm this story if anyone asks. The man never reached this plantation. You never saw him. Is that clear?" "Yes, master." "If you speak of this to anyone, I will know. And the consequences will be severe." "I understand, master." "You may go." Sarah left the study and returned to the kitchen. The threat in the colonel's words was real, but it also meant he was committed to the cover story. He could not expose her without exposing himself. They were bound together now in conspiracy and concealment. Evening came. Sarah served supper to the colonel and his wife. Mrs. Whitmore complained about the meat being overcooked. Sarah accepted the criticism without response and cleared the dishes. In the kitchen, she and Ruth prepared tomorrow's bread in silence. The routine was comforting in its familiarity. That night, Sarah lay on her mattress and finally allowed herself to feel the full impact of what she had done. The messenger's face came to her in the darkness, his surprised expression in the moment before the blow, his open eyes staring at nothing, the thin stream of blood from his nose. She had ended his life with cold premeditation. She had made the choice that he would not return to his wife and son, that his family would wait forever for news that would never come. The papers she had stolen were burned, destroyed in the cook fire earlier that day. The orders would never reach Colonel Hayes, Colonel Thornton, or Major Ashford. The coordination would fail. The manufactured incident, whatever it would have been, would not occur. 30 people marked for acceptable death would live, at least for now. Sarah had traded one life for 30. By the brutal mathematics of war and political calculation, she had made the correct choice. But mathematics did not account for the weight of actual killing, for the specific reality of watching someone die by your hand, for the permanent knowledge that you had ended a human life. She thought about Denmark Vesey, about Nat Turner, about all the people who had chosen violence in response to an inherently violent system. They had been executed, remembered as rebels and murderers by those in power. But they had acted. They had refused to accept their powerlessness. They had claimed agency through the only means available to them. Sarah had done the same. She had used the invisibility imposed on her as a weapon. She had reached into the machinery of federal power and broken one of its gears. One enslaved woman with no legal rights had altered the course of political events through carefully planned murder. The weight of it crushed down on her chest. She pulled the thin blanket over her head and finally allowed herself to cry, not from regret, not from guilt, but from the sheer enormity of what she carried now. She was a killer. She would always be a killer. That truth would follow her for the rest of her life, however long or short that might be. But 30 people would not die. That had to be enough. It had to be. Sarah cried until exhaustion pulled her into dreamless sleep. When she woke before dawn to begin another day, she forced the emotions back into silence. She had made her choice. She had acted with full knowledge and cold calculation. Now she would live with the consequences. She rose, dressed, and went to the kitchen to begin preparing breakfast. Mama Ruth was already there, stoking the fire. Their eyes met briefly and Ruth nodded once. An acknowledgement, a confirmation, a silent pact between two women who understood that some things could never be spoken. Sarah began her work. Outside, the sun was rising on a world that had changed in ways no one would ever recognize. The messenger was buried in the cellar. The orders were ash. The coordination had failed. And one invisible woman carried the weight of murder in her chest, knowing that she had claimed a power the law said she could never possess. She had killed. She would carry that forever. But she had also prevented the killing of others. In the impossible moral landscape of slavery and political violence, she had made the only choice she could live with. Now she would discover if that was enough. 3 days after the killing, federal investigators arrived at the plantation. There were 4 of them, 2 military officers in formal uniforms and 2 civilians who identified themselves as representatives of the Department of War. Colonel Whitmore received them in his study, while Sarah served tea with hands that no longer trembled. She had discovered something useful about surviving murder. After the first day, the body learned to function normally even while the mind remained in turmoil. The lead investigator was a captain named Morrison, a lean man in his 40s with sharp eyes that tracked every movement in the room. He accepted the tea Sarah offered and began his questions without preamble. The messenger departed Washington on schedule. His route included 3 stops: yours, Colonel Hayes in the valley, and Major Ashford at the border station. He never arrived at Hayes's location. The last confirmed sighting placed him 15 miles from your property. Colonel Whitmore's expression remained neutral. "I'm afraid he never reached us, Captain. We received no visitor that week." "You were expecting him, though. The communication was sent in advance." "Yes, but as you know, the roads are dangerous, particularly for federal couriers carrying valuable documents." Morrison set down his teacup. "The messenger's horse was found yesterday, wandering near the river crossing. No saddle, no dispatch case, no sign of the rider. We are treating this as probable robbery and murder." Sarah stood motionless against the wall, a piece of furniture performing its function. Morrison's eyes flicked to her once, a brief assessment that found nothing worth noting, and returned to the colonel. "I'll need to question your household staff. Standard procedure." "Of course." They questioned everyone. Morrison and his colleague took each person separately: the field workers, the kitchen staff, the house servants. When Sarah's turn came, she sat in the dining room where she had killed the messenger and answered in the carefully practiced voice of someone who knew nothing. "Did you see any strangers on the property that week?" "No, sir." "Did the colonel mention expecting a visitor?" "No, sir. The master doesn't discuss his business with me." "Did you notice anything unusual? Riders on the road, sounds at night, anything out of the ordinary?" "No, sir. Everything was normal." Morrison studied her face for several seconds. Sarah kept her expression blank and slightly fearful, the default mode of an enslaved person being questioned by white authority. It was a mask she had worn her entire life, and it served her now. "You're the house servant. You would have prepared a room if a guest was expected." "Yes, sir. But no guest came." "Very well. You may go." Sarah left the room and returned to the kitchen. Mama Ruth was already there, having finished her own questioning. They worked in silence, preparing the midday meal for the investigators. Through the window, Sarah could see the federal men searching the grounds, looking for evidence that did not exist. The investigation continued for 2 days. The men examined the road approaching the plantation, interviewed neighbors, searched outbuildings. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. The messenger was buried under grain sacks in the cellar, and the orders were ash scattered in the cook fire days ago. On the 3rd day, Captain Morrison delivered his conclusion to Colonel Whitmore in the study. Sarah was present, serving coffee. We believe the messenger was killed by criminals or southern agitators on the road to your property. The dispatches he carried were likely destroyed or are in the hands of those who killed him. The case is being classified as murder by unknown assailants. The colonel nodded gravely. A tragedy. These are dangerous times. Indeed. The orders he was carrying dealt with sensitive military positioning. Their loss is concerning. Will they be reissued? Morrison hesitated. The coordination window has passed. New circumstances require new plans. The original orders are no longer relevant. Sarah felt something release in her chest. The words were careful and bureaucratic, but their meaning was clear. The manufactured incident would not occur. The timeline had failed. Whatever violence had been planned would not happen, at least not in the way it had been designed. The investigators departed that afternoon. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as their horses disappeared down the road. Colonel Whitmore stood on the front steps, his posture rigid. When he came to the kitchen later that evening, his face was drawn. "The matter is closed," he told Sarah directly. "No one speaks of it. Ever." "Yes, master." He looked at her with an expression she could not quite read, suspicion mixed with something else. Fear, perhaps, or unwilling respect. He knew she was lying. He probably suspected her involvement, but he also knew that the investigation had concluded in his favor, and any attempt to reopen it would raise questions he could not afford to answer. "You're a clever girl, Sarah. Too clever. That's dangerous." "I'm just a house servant, master."
No.
"You're something else. I don't know what, but you're not what you pretend to be." He paused at the kitchen door. "But as long as you serve this household properly, we'll have no problems. Do we understand each other?" "Yes, master." He left. Sarah stood alone in the kitchen and understood that a new balance had been established. The colonel would not pursue her because pursuing her would expose him. She would continue her work because any change would raise suspicion. They were bound together in mutual concealment, keeper and kept of a shared secret. The weeks passed. Spring turned to summer and summer began fading toward fall. Sarah worked through each day with mechanical precision, her body performing tasks while her mind remained elsewhere. She had nightmares most nights, the messenger's face, the sound of the skillet striking bone, the feeling of earth falling on a body in a dark grave. She woke with her heart racing and forced herself back to sleep through sheer willpower. Mama Ruth watched her with knowing eyes but asked no questions. Thomas noticed the change in her but respected her silence. The rest of the household saw nothing. She remained invisible, unremarkable, exactly what they expected an enslaved house servant to be. News filtered in slowly through travelers and newspapers the colonel read aloud to his wife. Federal troops had not mobilized as expected. The border situation remained tense but had not escalated. Whatever coordination had been planned, whatever manufactured incident had been designed to trigger wider conflict, had not materialized. Sarah listened to these fragments and understood that she had succeeded. One missing set of orders had disrupted the machinery enough to stop it, at least temporarily. But success brought no peace. She had killed a man and prevented deaths, and both truths existed simultaneously in her mind without resolution. At night, lying on her mattress, she argued with herself in silence. The messenger had been innocent of any crime except serving his government. He had a wife and son who deserved to know what happened to him. His death was murder regardless of justification. But 30 people, maybe more, had not died in a manufactured crisis. The escalation had been prevented. The federal government's plan had failed because one enslaved woman had claimed the power to act when no one else would or could. Sarah discovered that moral certainty was a luxury of those who never had to make impossible choices. She had acted with the information she had, in the moment she had it, with the limited options available to her. Whether that made her a murderer or a defender, a criminal or a protector, depended entirely on perspective. 3 months after the killing, Sarah was in the Colonel's study dusting shelves when she overheard him speaking with a visitor, a neighboring plantation owner discussing politics. The conversation turned to federal military plans and the mysterious disappearance of several important communications. "They say someone in the chain broke," the visitor said. "Orders that never arrived. Coordination that fell apart. The whole border operation collapsed because critical information went missing." "Bandits and criminals," the colonel replied. "The roads aren't safe for official couriers." "Or something more deliberate. I've heard rumors of infiltration, of enemy agents intercepting communications." Rumors are cheap. Results are what matter. The escalation was prevented, whatever the cause. Sarah continued her dusting, her face neutral. The visitor and the colonel moved on to other topics, but the words stayed with her. They were constructing narratives to explain what had happened. Enemy agents, criminal gangs, deliberate sabotage by organized forces. None of them would ever suspect that one enslaved woman with a cast-iron skillet had altered the course of events. That evening, Sarah sat in the kitchen after the day's work was finished. Mama Ruth was preparing vegetables for tomorrow's soup. Sarah finally spoke the question that had been growing in her mind for months. "Do you think I did the right thing?" Ruth's hands never stopped moving. Right for who? For everyone. For the people who didn't die. For the messenger who did. There's no right when all choices are wrong. You picked one wrong over another wrong. Whether that makes it right. Ruth shrugged. "You'll have to decide that for yourself. I killed a man who never hurt me, who was just doing his job, and saved people who never knew they needed saving. Both things are true." Sarah nodded slowly. "So I carry both." That's what it means to act. You carry the consequences. Forever. They worked in silence. Sarah thought about the messenger buried under the cellar, about his wife Mary waiting for a letter that would never come, about his son Thomas growing up without a father. She thought about the 30 people marked for acceptable death in federal orders, about the manufactured incident that never occurred, about the escalation that had been prevented. The story began to spread among the enslaved community, though Sarah never confirmed or denied her role. It became legend told in careful whispers, in coded songs, in stories that never mentioned names. There was a woman, the story went, who stopped a storm before it could break. She had no power, no rights, no voice, but she had acted anyway, and the powerful never knew what she had done. Thomas heard the whispers. One night, he came to Sarah directly. "Was it you?" She looked at her brother, 19 years old, strong and angry, carrying his own dreams of rebellion and freedom. "Why would you think that?" "Because I know you. Because you're smarter than you pretend to be. Because you understand things the rest of us miss." He paused. "Did you stop it? Whatever was coming?" Sarah considered her answer carefully. If someone had the chance to prevent violence, to save lives, even if it meant doing something terrible, should they? That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give. Thomas studied her face in the dim light. "Then I'll tell you what I think. I think someone saw what was coming and had the courage to act. I think that person saved lives in a way none of us could. And I think that person will carry the weight of it alone because that's what courage costs." He left without waiting for confirmation. Sarah sat in the darkness and felt the truth of his words. She would carry this alone. She could not share the burden, could not seek absolution, could not explain or justify. The only witness to her choice was herself, and she would be her own judge for the rest of her life. Years passed. The border situation remained tense, but the expected escalation never materialized. New tensions arose and faded. The machinery of government and war continued its grinding progress, but the specific crisis that would have been triggered by those burned orders never came to pass. Sarah worked in the plantation house, invisible and unremarkable, carrying her secret like a stone in her chest. She never spoke of what she had done. When federal investigators returned years later with new questions about the missing messenger, she gave the same blank answers. When travelers told stories about mysterious disappearances on the dangerous roads, she listened without expression. When Thomas eventually escaped north during the chaos of the war that did eventually come, she sent him with her blessing and the knowledge that some resistance required violence while other resistance required invisibility. Mama Ruth died in the winter of 1859, taking whatever she had known or suspected to her grave. On the day they buried her behind the kitchen, Sarah stood at the grave and thought about all the women like Ruth, women who carried secret knowledge, who witnessed history from the invisible corners, who understood power in ways the powerful never recognized. The war came in 1861 despite all attempts to prevent it. Sarah understood that she had only delayed the inevitable, not stopped it. But delay had value. The men who would have died in the manufactured incident of 1857 had lived 4 more years. Some of them had children in those years, wrote letters, planted crops, loved their families. The escalation she prevented had allowed time for other paths to be tried, even if those paths ultimately failed. When federal troops finally occupied the plantation in 1863, Sarah was still there, still serving in the house, still invisible to those in power. An officer asked her questions about the colonel's activities, and she answered truthfully about everything except the body in the cellar. That secret she kept, not to protect the colonel, but because the messenger deserved to rest in peace rather than become evidence in someone else's prosecution. The Emancipation Proclamation came and Sarah remained at the plantation through the transition. She had nowhere else to go, no family to return to, no resources to build a new life. Freedom meant the legal right to leave but not the practical means to survive leaving. She stayed and watched the world change around her in ways both profound and superficial. Colonel Whitmore died in 1867. On the day they buried him, Sarah stood at a distance and thought about the strange bond they had shared, 2 people bound by shared guilt and mutual silence. He had suspected her involvement in the messenger's death until the end, but he had never acted on that suspicion. In his own twisted way, he had protected her by maintaining the cover story they had both needed. After the colonel's death, Sarah finally left the plantation. She was 42 years old and had spent her entire life in service to that house. She took nothing with her except the clothes she wore and the weight of memory. She settled in a small town 20 miles away and found work as a seamstress. No one there knew her history. She was simply Sarah, a freedwoman making her way in the new world. She lived another 30 years, dying in 1897 at the age of 72. In all those years, she never told anyone what she had done. The secret died with her, buried like the messenger had been buried, hidden in darkness, known only to those who had witnessed it. But legends have a way of surviving even when the truth dies. Among the descendants of the enslaved community at the plantation, stories persisted about a woman who had stopped a war before it started. The details changed with each telling. Sometimes she was a conjure woman, sometimes a spy, sometimes a saint. None of the stories got it exactly right because the truth was too complicated, too morally ambiguous, too human. The truth was that an enslaved woman with no legal rights had claimed moral authority through violence. She had killed a man to prevent the killing of others. She had acted with premeditation and cold calculation. She had broken the law, violated moral codes, and committed murder. She had also saved lives, prevented escalation, and altered the course of events through sheer will and terrible courage. The question of whether her action was justified cannot be answered simply. She committed murder. That is fact. She saved lives. That is also fact. Both truths exist simultaneously, and any attempt to elevate one over the other does violence to the complexity of her choice. What can be said is this: Sarah acted in a moral landscape that offered no good options. She chose to claim agency in a system designed to deny her any agency. She used the invisibility imposed on her as a weapon. She accepted the moral weight of killing because she could not accept the moral weight of inaction. Whether that makes her a murderer or a hero, whether her choice was justified or criminal, whether she should be condemned or celebrated, these questions have no simple answers. What remains is the fact of her action and its consequences. One messenger died. 30 people marked for manufactured death lived. Federal coordination collapsed. An escalation was delayed. And one woman carried the weight of it all alone, without recognition, without absolution, without the comfort of certainty. History does not record Sarah's full name. She appears in plantation records simply as Sarah, house servant, without family name or personal history. The messenger's death was recorded as murder by unknown assailants, and the case remains officially unsolved. The orders that were destroyed are noted in federal archives as lost in transit, with no explanation of how or why. But the absence of official record does not mean the absence of impact. Sarah's action changed the course of events in ways that can never be fully measured. The 30 people who did not die in 1857 went on to live their lives. Some died in the war that came later, some survived to see emancipation, some had children who exist today because Sarah made the choice she made. The messenger's descendants, his son Thomas and his wife Mary, lived with the pain of not knowing what happened to their husband and father. That pain was real and undeserved. Sarah gave them no closure, no body to bury, no truth to provide comfort. That burden is also part of the consequence of her action. There are questions we should ask when confronting this history. Can someone denied all legal rights claim moral authority to kill? Sarah had no standing in law. She could not testify in court, could not make contracts, could not own property including herself. Yet she made a life-and-death decision that affected the fate of others. Does powerlessness justify seizing power through violence, or does it simply create more violence? Is political murder ever justified to prevent greater violence? The calculus Sarah used, one death to prevent 30, is the same calculus used by governments and armies throughout history. When individuals make that calculation without authority, we call them murderers. When states make it, we call it strategy. Where is the line? What do we owe to historical actors who operated in impossible moral situations? Sarah had no good options. She could act and become a killer, or not act and allow preventable deaths. We who look back from a position of safety and comfort cannot fully understand the weight of that choice. How do we judge actions taken under circumstances we can barely imagine? How many other invisible acts shaped history without record? Sarah's story survives only as legend because the truth was too dangerous to tell. How many other people, enslaved, powerless, denied voice and agency, acted in ways that altered the course of events but left no trace in official history? These questions have no simple answers. But asking them is important because it forces us to confront the reality that history is made not just by the powerful and the recognized, but also by the invisible hands reaching from the margins, acting in darkness, carrying weights that no one else will ever fully understand. Sarah lived and died without recognition. She saved lives that never knew they needed saving. She killed a man who never knew why he had to die. She carried the weight of her choice in silence for 40 years until death released her from the burden. Was she a murderer? Yes. Was she a protector? Also yes. Was her action justified? That depends on what framework of justice you apply: legal, moral, utilitarian, religious. Different frameworks give different answers. What cannot be denied is that she acted with full knowledge of consequences, that she claimed agency when she had none, that she used violence to prevent violence, and that she carried the moral weight of her choice without seeking absolution or praise. In the end, Sarah's story is not about heroism or villainy. It is about the impossible choices forced on those trapped in systems of violence and oppression. It is about the hidden costs of agency claimed without permission. It is about the moral complexity that official history erases in favor of simpler narratives. She was one woman with no power who decided to act anyway. The cost was one life taken and a lifetime of carrying that weight. The result was lives saved and a course altered. Both are true. Both matter. And the tension between them is where the real moral reckoning lies, not in simple condemnation or celebration, but in the recognition that some situations offer no good choices, only terrible ones that must be made anyway. Sarah made her choice. She lived with it. She died with it. And her story, incomplete, ambiguous, morally complex, remains as a challenge to anyone who believes that history is simple or that justice offers clear answers. In the darkness of the cellar beneath the old plantation, in the ash of burned orders, in the invisible hands that reached and acted and changed the world without recognition, Sarah's legacy persists. Not as lesson or moral instruction, but as a reminder that power exists even in powerlessness, that agency can be claimed even by those denied it, and that the weight of choosing between terrible options is the heaviest burden any human can carry. She was enslaved. She was a killer. She was a protector. She was a woman who acted when action seemed impossible and lived with consequences that offered no peace. That is her story. Make of it what you will.